So welcome to the Blitzscaling Yourself live stream. I'm Julien Newman. I'm building a new startup, and every week, although not next week, I do this live stream with Chris. Really, I come across a obstacle, and Chris helps me deal with it, overcome it. Chris Gay, he's one of the world's most famous investors. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Julien.
And
so one
Chris,
of the things I want to mention for the live stream audience, I want them to know that there's nothing wrong with the audio. There's actually a family of birds where you are, Julien, that is making that noise.
Yeah, I'm at my wife's mother's home in their in Taiwan, in their artist workshop, and there's a family of birds that built a nest here, which I don't know. But anyways, I'll finish introducing you. Chris, you founded your own VC fund, Blitzscaling Ventures, and you invest in some of the best tech businesses. You're mostly known as the author of the book Blitzscaling, which you co-authored with the founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman. The foreword is written by Bill Gates. It's taught at Princeton, Yale, Harvard. It's part of the core business curriculum. So you're a real big shot.
Well, I do my best. I imagine that it is possible to be much, much bigger, but I will settle for being a big fish in the pond of this current podcast. And again, hopefully we're going to grow this pond and we're all going to be bigger.
So, Chris, so for the people watching, the way that this works, we do this live stream, which is like me and Chris discussing a topic, more free flowing. And I don't know what Chris is going to say. We haven't discussed this topic. It's like very raw. And then at the end of the live stream, we record the episode separately, which is a more condensed version of the same conversation. If you're listening to this live stream, a recorded version, you can flip over to that episode if you want, something that's 15 minutes, and if you want, more depth, you can stay here.
Sounds good.
All right. So, Chris, this issue or this kind of question, A, it came up for me this week, and B, it's something I've been thinking about because it's something you brought up. And the context is you and I used to do these discussion groups with a variety of people, and one of the people that was part of the discussion group, this guy called Sean Kelly, who's a prof at Harvard. And you had told him, like, we were discussing something about like how to be convincing to people. And one of the things you mentioned is that the way that the VC and entrepreneur relationship works, just like I come and pitch you, isn't actually that natural and isn't really the optimal way of being convincing and of collaborating with people. And it's so that's been something that's kind of been in the back of my mind as I start working, well, generally, and then also as I start working on a new business, where presumably I'll have some financial partners. And then the reason it came up this week is that I was speaking to this guy, Ross Fubini, who you know, Chris.
Absolutely, yep.
And who did an interview with us. Great interview. Everyone can listen to it if you're interested. But Ross kind of like followed up with me, and he's like, hey, if you're kind of like navigating the idea maze, I would love to be helpful. And what I did is send him some information to get his input on it. And to that felt in many ways much more natural than, let's say if I say, Chris, introduce me to Ross, and then I go see Ross, I'm like, Ross, here's my business. It's the best business. And the way that I was able to communicate with him, which is like, hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you see as the area, like the risks, and how should I think about them? Feels much more natural. So I'll stop there and let you. Like the question is, what is the optimal way? Assuming that I know all the VCs I want to know,
Right.
assuming that I'm, the very early stages where I am, honestly, I think both those things are true. What is the optimal way for me to be convincing to, the best financial partners?
Got it. So I think that this is one of those things where most people have this perception that entrepreneurs and investors are on opposite sides of the table. And to some extent that is true because equity that is owned by investors is equity that's not owned by founders. But on the other hand, I think as you've seen from your conversations with Ross, I think you have a good instinct there. That's much better when the investor and entrepreneur are on the same side of the table, working together. And the question becomes, how do I do this? Because the fact is, when you have the conversation with the investor, it's still a pitch. The investor, unless they're a close personal friend, is not going to want to spend time working on your project unless they think it's going to be really successful. So you still have to convince them that it's going to be successful. So that's the first and foremost element of it. And that means having a good idea. That means gathering evidence. That means doing work. You can't just sort of go to investors and say, oh, I'm thinking about this. I would love your input because you're really smart about this. Well, what's in it for the investor? The only thing that matters is if you have a pre-existing relationship or if they think that this is something that could potentially be a big moneymaker for them. But assuming that you have that, the right thing to do is to say, okay, I've made the sale. I've got them interested in what I'm doing. Now I can shift to being on the same side of the table. Because then what I'm doing is it's not that I'm trying to convince them to invest. It's I'm letting them convince themselves, which is far more powerful. And a great example of this is my co-author, Reid Hoffman. Very famously, he is the Series A lead investor in Airbnb. And what ended up happening is he had turned them down before. He had never spoken with them, but some fellow investor tried to introduce them, said, hey, this is the next generation of couch surfing. And Reid said, not interested. And then a second investor said, you really should talk with them. And Reid's like, no, I heard about this couch surfing thing, not really interested. And he said, well, it's not really couch surfing. It's something very different. It's really more about being an eBay for all space and physical locations. Reid was like, well, that's much bigger, much more interesting. And he said, okay, I'm willing to meet with the founders. And I said, can you guys and 2 minutes into the conversation, Reid said, listen, this time is a working session. And that is helpful because not only do you get a better sense of what the entrepreneur is like and how they approach things, but they get a better sense of the investor and how they approach things. So it's obviously superior. But to get there, they first had to convince Reid that this was a good idea and that he could make a lot of money.
I'm taking notes here.
Yep. Let me just see. I've got, as long as we're here, I've got like a call in from my partner. I just want to make sure it's not essential. He would presumably send a text message if it was. But I will. It could also be a butt dial.
The most elegant type of dial.
Yes, it does happen a lot. It does happen fairly frequently.
So, okay, so part of the so part of the thing is that I actually do want input from people and actually do need help. And I have like an authentic need for smart people who are used to thinking about businesses
Right.
to kind of like give me negative feedback so that I know if I'm headed in the wrong direction.
Okay.
Right. So that's part of the reality. The other part of the reality, which you allude to, is that I need to be mindful of using people's time, um, in a high ROI manner, right? So, for example, uh, Ben Kasnoka, who we both know, who was an investor and who Ross was a partner with Ben at the fund.
Yep.
I haven't asked Ben for input because I don't feel that it is high ROI enough yet for him to provide input. So I think there's a middle ground where it's like, hey, I'm actually early enough in my thought process that I can take in this information and that it's maximally helpful taking this information, but then I'm far enough in the thought process that the idea feels compelling enough that it feels high ROI for the person to provide input. Is
Right.
that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that you have to balance being early enough for them to actually have an influence with being far enough along that it's worth it for them to spend their time on it. And so you can sort of think of it as saying, okay, well, there are these two different factors. One is how easy is it for me to convince people that this is worth their time? And the other is, am I early enough to allow them to really shape this and buy into it through the endowment effect? And so if you find yourself in a situation where you cannot get enough convincing evidence about it being something that's you got to be able to establish without being so far along that people can't help you shape it.
One thing that occurs to me as I hear you talk about this is that where that point needs to actually be might be, I don't know if this is true, but maybe this is the key, maybe not, which is you need to have gathered evidence about the problem. And like that's not something that a venture capital investor can help you with, right? Unless it's a VC adjacent or VC native problem. They're just not going to help you with that. Those are potential customers. So you need to gather evidence about the problem.
Right.
When you get to the solution stage, then relatively early in that process, it would make sense because you have evidence, and it's hopefully compelling evidence of a big problem for people who matter and who would pay, and their expertise, which is on the kind of solution side, like they've seen all the competitors, they thought about the new trends, can actually be helpful. Is that right?
I think that's correct, but I think it's a special case as opposed to the general case because you're sort of describing it as a question of understanding the problem and them understanding the solution. And I think it's more a question of, is there enough evidence to convince people that this is going to work? And obviously, understanding the problem is part of that, but then also understanding the consumer willingness to pay, a bit more about the go to market, all those various things. You want to be able to have evidence of promise, but you want to be early enough so that people can help you shape it. And that evidence of promise may be problem related or it might not be. It might be, for example, the team that you've gathered, right? The better the team you have, the earlier you can go to an investor for this kind of conversation.
What are the other types of evidence that you would consider compelling? So it's evidence, from team, evidence about the problem.
Having a product that you can demonstrate.
all the kind of like normal VC type.
Yeah. All the ways to mitigate the risks that they perceive. Again, when you're talking to the VC, it's always a pitch. They have to be convinced that your product is going to be successful before they engage. They may be willing to engage with you if they have a personal relationship, or it's, they're sentimental because you went to their university or something like that. But in general, they've got to be convinced that there's a decent chance that you'll make money.
Okay, so and then like so how would you think of the actual value of getting these people's input? So
Depends. It depends on the relevance of their information. I mean, it's just like any other party. So there is the value they bring with their advice, and that can be valued the same way as anyone else. Do they have relevant experience? Do they have good judgment? Are the things they're telling me useful? There's a secondary source of value creation, which is the more involved they are in shaping your product, the more likely they are to invest. That's a separate form of value creation.
but sort of like, irregardless of the kind of like fact that they might or might not invest in the future,
Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's you'd never say irregardless. That's not actually a word. It's regardless.
Regardless, right?
Right. It's just
In
regardless.
French,
There's no
you'd say
irregardless.
irregardless.
Yes, but we speak in English, so there is no irregardless. The other thing is, I mean, the whole reason that you're speaking with an investor is because they're an investor. If you were to say, I want to get feedback on this idea, they're probably not investors from whom you can get good feedback as well. And so the reason you're speaking to an investor is because they're an investor.
Right. So like, so let's take the thing that would make an investor have useful input would be they invested in a company that has similar business dynamics and that you'd learn from. And then you would say, okay, well, you could speak to that VC, but you could also speak to the CEO of that company, or one of the founders of that company, who would presumably have better, or at least as good, information to provide you with.
Right.
And that would be the optimal person to give you input, not the investor.
That's correct. Unless, the one benefit of the investor may be that they're not as attached to one particular solution or one particular way of approaching the problem. So they may have a broader sense than an individual entrepreneur, but their sense may not be as strong as that of an industry analyst or what have you. Again, my point is not that investors are bad people to seek out. It's just that they are not necessarily the absolute best. And part of the reason you seek them out is specifically because you may want them to invest money in the future.
So you would think of asking people for input as an activity asking venture capital investors for input as an activity you would perform really as part of the pitch. Like there's no, like you shouldn't kind of mix that up with other goals.
Except that, I mean, you should have the primary goal. The primary goal should be to get their money. And the secondary goal can involve gathering information and learning. And again, if you approach somebody not because they're an investor, because they're a friend or an expert and they just happen to be an investor, well, that's fine too. But then at least you understand the reason why you're approaching them. And you can probably still, get extra value by approaching them about investing as well.
Right. So let's say if I asked Ben for input, let's say if I say Ben has a portfolio company that is super relevant and where him having thought through this would be helpful, I'd be asking him more as a friend than as an investor, with a kind of like side thing of, yeah, he is an investor too. But if I'm approaching someone that I don't have a pre-existing strong relationship with, then I would approach it primarily as a pitch.
Right. And again, you don't have to express it as a pitch, because venture capitalists don't always like getting pitches unless they're looking to invest in that space. But you, in your mind, are approaching it like a pitch, because you are trying to persuade them that what you're doing is really exciting.
Okay, and then the so let's say in the so the kind of like optimal way to pitch is the real thing that we're trying to get at here. And the optimal way to pitch would be, I have some evidence, but I still am learning and crafting a lot of really important parts of the business. And I'm not looking to raise immediately. I am truly looking for input, and I'm going to see people who have relevant input, just investors invested in relevant businesses. And then I'm holding their hand as I make them believe more and more in what I'm discovering.
Yes, that's a good summary. And again, part of the benefit is by going through this process with them, they're seeing you over time and becoming far more comfortable with trusting you.
Right. What specifically, what parts of that is like communicating, knowing that if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. What are the other components of that?
Well, you saying that you're going to do something and you're doing it, the increasing weight of evidence for what you're doing. And then frankly, do they actually enjoy spending time with you? Because that is something that factors in as well. I mean, what I tell people all the time is, you don't know whether or not a company is going to work out, but you do know whether or not someone's an asshole. So why are you going to do that? You're going to only work with people that you enjoy. Apply that filter first.
So there's part of it is that they can more naturally wrap their head around the evidence that you're collecting. In theory, you could just like present it all, but that's not how people think. Like they ingest evidence over time, or ingest information over time. But the thing that's kind of like a line that they need time to learn about is mostly about you as a partner. And you as a partner is, a big part of it is that, do they want to spend time with you? A big part of it is, do you communicate in a professional manner that like other people, like other VCs, let's say, would engage with, and employees, stuff like that? And are you somebody who like gets things done, does what they say they're going to do, is reliable, etc.?
Right, because the whole process of your convincing them to invest in the company is a microcosm of all these other things you do: convincing employees to join, convincing customers to buy, convincing users to adopt. And so if you can't convince the investor, you're probably not going to be able to convince those other people.
Right. So I'm trying to think of I think that the element that's missing for me before we can jump into the actual episode thing is to understand, or to like what's the optimal time to engage folks. And maybe we can bucket those people into like, I know them super well.
So how about this? So the optimal, we can bucket them, but really it boils down to the optimal time. The optimal time to engage folks is when you have gathered enough evidence and information to be convinced yourself that what you're doing is really powerful and interesting. Don't reach out to investors when you're not sure, saying, well, I'm trying to figure out if this is a good idea or not, unless you have a really good pre-existing relationship with them. Because then what can happen is they may say, well, there's something I've always wanted to see someone do or work on or what have you. And that could be interesting. Most often it's not, but it could still. It could be interesting.
So it's like when you're yourself convinced that this is like you're ready to invest your time into it, then that's when you should expect them to invest their time.
Right. Exactly. It's not their job to help you figure out if something's a good idea.
Unless you have a really strong pre-existing relationship, and then how would you?
That's right.
Like
you would say, I'm coming to you as a friend and somebody who really understands the space. I'm trying to figure out if this is worth it or not. Can you help me? And again, there's no reason for an investor who does not know you to do that. It's a waste of their time. But if it's a friend, they may be willing to do that because they want to help you.
So let's take 3 different people that I know. So, and I think you know, this guy Hadley Harris, who you know.
Over at ENIAC, yep.
Yeah. I've known Hadley for many years. He's considered investing in dedicated, was interested in doing it. We finally cut it short, but he's someone like I've known for 5 years and have a really good relationship with. He was on our podcast, but I haven't like collaborated with him in the same way that I collaborated with Ben. Then there's Ben, who was my boss, right? Like he was an actual, investor through his fund in my business, and
an investor isn't your boss, but we'll permit that.
Right. Well, as it's just like a different relationship. And then I have a relationship with you, which is professional, but, more friendly than, my relationship with Ben. Like you're not, like you've never been in a position where you could potentially be able to fire me or something like that.
Right.
Is there a different time to engage those?
Yeah, let's cover those 3. So let's say it was with me, and because you're a friend and I enjoy spending time with you, you would be able to come to me quite early and say, as you have, saying, oh, here are some different ideas I'm thinking about. What do you think? And I would be willing to invest my time in that simply because I want to help you and I enjoy spending time with you. So you can approach me relatively early. And you might as well try to make that. Ben, part of it is also that Ben is less sentimental than I am and more rational, more of a rationalist. Prefers to. It's an illusion, by the way. People believing they're rational is an illusion. They're being driven by emotion all the time. They just don't realize it. But, the people who believe themselves to be rationalists will try to approach things in a different way. And with Ben, you would want to approach him when you had already convinced yourself, because he would logically say, well, why are you wasting my time if you don't think it's worth it? So you would need to have convinced yourself. You wouldn't need to have an airtight case. You could be at the stage where it's like, I think this could be interesting. And that's also because Village does a lot of incubation and operating at the very early stages where they understand it may not be fully baked, right? If you were trying to pitch someone who is a later stage investor, it would be a different story. And then finally, Hadley, who also is pretty early, but not necessarily an incubator kind of guy. With Hadley, you would probably, again, want to wait until you're pretty convinced and where you felt like you had a fairly buttoned up case, right? He wouldn't necessarily be the first person or the first investor you reached out to. You would have already spoken with someone like Ben first before you got to the point where you'd speak with Hadley.
So kind of like the summary is, I talk to people who are like my actual personal friends and also investors.
Yeah.
Then I would talk to the people that have like a less, like just like go down that list.
Yeah, have a professional relationship with, and they have more information about me. They're more bought in, but they still are going to take a rational, utility-based approach to talking with me. And then finally, it's the people with whom you have a more distant relationship where they're taking a chance. And so you really want to have your story well in order to convey in 15 seconds, yes, you should pay attention to this. Now let's talk.
There's another bucket which came to mind, which are people I don't know, but who would have a useful perspective. So for example, let's say I speak to Ben and Ben says, oh yeah, actually I invested in this business and here's what I learned from investing in this business. And that's how it's applicable to you. I'd say, wow, Ben, like this was so helpful, like great information there. And then I would identify, hey, there's this other fund that actually invested earlier than you in that business, and here's a GP that invested, or the partner invested. Could you connect me to that partner to get some input? Right, like that's kind of the scenario.
Right.
Would I would I kind of consider them a Hadley or an after Hadley, or how would I think about them?
You don't have a personal relationship, and I actually think in that situation, and maybe I'm projecting, but in that situation, I think that Ben might be reluctant to do that introduction because it's like, well, hold on, any favor I ask is creating an expectation of a favor in return. And so it's one thing to take action on my own. It's another thing to rope another investor in, unless I'm either doing it for due diligence for a potential investment or because I'm already invested. Right. So that's why I think it goes beyond Hadley. What would be far more likely would be to say, oh, yeah, that person probably would be an interesting person to talk with. Why don't you put together an email detailing what kinds of things you're trying to learn and that you want to talk with them, and I can forward that and see what happens.
Yeah. So does that mean that for some so essentially it's like someone that I feel would have a useful perspective, I have some specific questions for them, but I don't know them, and maybe in that case I should just be pitching them like normal, because they only want to spend 30 minutes with me because they don't know me, and they want to be pitched because that's the quickest use of their time.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily frame it as a pitch. You say, I want to talk to you for 30 minutes. Let me go over what we're doing and get your thoughts because of your expertise in this area. But they're most likely to say yes if you frame it as a pitch. Now, again, let's think about other things that can affect how likely or how willing they are to talk with you about it. Obviously, the most important thing is they can make money off it. But if you were famous or interesting in some other way, they might be more willing to talk with you. So, for example, somebody who is very famous, like Michael Jordan, probably has an easier time getting people to talk with him just because they want to talk with Michael Jordan.
Right. Let's say in the case of Ross, I didn't know Ross before at all, and he volunteered this probably because I built a relationship with him kind of through our podcast, and he felt that we got along really well. And
right, he had it, and part of it is, look, it's building the relationship. It's also that he spent enough time with you to say, I think this guy is a capable entrepreneur. Right? You want to give people the ability to have selfish reasons to help you. For people who already know you and like you, people who are friends may help you for unselfish reasons. People who don't know you as well, you want them to help you for selfish reasons. You need to give them those selfish reasons.
Right. So it's really like actual friend, that's someone you'd engage, the earliest, and then someone you have a more professional but close relationship, you'd engage them next. People that you have a good but less deep professional relationship, you'd engage them next. And then it's a question. Then the trick is to generate situations where the right people have selfish reasons to be willing to help you, and invest more than 30 minutes just reviewing your deck.
That's right. And again, you have to be able to give them those selfish reasons.
And the main selfish reasons for, VC would be that they think you're an entrepreneur who will be successful in the future.
That's right.
Presumably, like if they think that you can help them, raise some LPs, stuff like that. But that's, it's a little bit like weird to do that.
Well, again, most entrepreneurs can't actually help VCs raise from LPs. That's the thing. If you could, if you were willing to say, well, I happen to sit on the investment committee of this pension fund and source venture funds. I think every venture capitalist would be delighted to talk with you. Just because they now need to talk with you, there's a very clear value add.
Right. So, and then the way to, so let's take the Ross example. So the Ross example is he has a selfish reason. The other selfish reason that presumably is like easy for entrepreneurs is that you can connect them to other good entrepreneurs.
Correct. Exactly. But you have to demonstrate that you have that ability, right? Which is why things like fame and connections are important.
Yeah, so that actually is exactly how this came up with Ross, because I was talking to him and I was like, yeah, Ben. I'd never met Ross, I just cold emailed him. But obviously he was a partner with Ben at Village. And so I was just telling him, hey, I spoke to Ben yesterday because I just made an intro to founder for him, because Ben likes getting in like super early and talking. It's like an AI is like super in right now, so he wants to meet these kind of machine learning experts who are repeat founders, and I know a lot of them. So I've connected him to these people, and Ross was like, oh, I want to meet these people too.
Right. There you go. You gave him a clear reason to want to build a relationship with you.
Right. Okay.
And so the overall point is, and maybe this is a way of thinking about it, there has to be a reason for them to talk with you. One source of that reason is the personal relationship you already have. And that's why you can talk with your friends earlier than you can talk with other folks. Another source of that reason is you gathering the evidence that what you're working on is going to make people a lot of money. But the final thing are things that are independent of your relationship and independent of your company, i.e. your connections or ability to otherwise help them.
And the main way for entrepreneurs to help VCs is if they believe you can make intros to actually good entrepreneurs. Like that's actually what they want from founders.
Yes, they would certainly settle for introductions to great LPs as well, but it is less likely that entrepreneurs have those.
Okay. I'll redo the intro, and we'll do the episode portion. So I'll take a break for folks who are listening to this. We're really just going to rehash in a hopefully more concise and clear manner what I learned from Chris right now. So welcome to Blitzscaling Yourself. I'm Julien Newman. I'm building a new startup, and every week I come across one obstacle. Chris helps me overcome it. Chris Ye is one of the world's most famous investors. He founded his own VC fund, and he invests in some of the best technology businesses in the world. Chris is mostly known as the author of Blitzscaling, the book that he co-authored with the founder of LinkedIn. The introduction to that book was written by Bill Gates. It's a core part of the business curriculum at universities like Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Julian. And I do want to note for anyone who is listening that you may hear a chirping noise in the background. That is not some sort of audio artifact. There are actually birds where you are, Julian. And I guess that means you're in a beautiful place with lots of nature, but it also means there's going to be a little chirping.
Yeah, I'm surrounded by rice paddies, which I'd never seen rice paddies before. But I actually went to pick some vegetables the other day.
Wow.
They're looking for manual labor. So I went to do that for a day, which was an interesting experience.
Absolutely. So what's the issue that you're dealing with or wrestling with today?
So the question here is really like how to pitch investors or how to convince investors, VCs, to invest in your business. And, what I'm trying to get at is, not how to have the best pitch, but, what's the actual optimal way to guide people to believing that your business is going to be successful. And I'm, at the very earliest stages of my business, so I actually don't know what I'm building. And there are opportunities which we unearth together to, leverage that timing to make my case that much more compelling. And so really what we're, getting at is that, the way to convince somebody to, believe in something, to believe the evidence that you're giving them, is to guide them over time, make them an ally and a partner, rather than being, on opposite sides of the table, bring them on the same side of the table. And a starting point here, Chris, would be if you could, unpack or explain why is it superior to be on the same side of the table?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we begin with three key things that we have to bear in mind. The first is the IKEA effect. And the IKEA effect is that which we put work into, we value more. So when investors are working with you to build the case for your company, they're buying in. And because they're investing their own time, their brains are like, well, you're investing your time in this. This must be valuable. And so it increases the chances that they will invest. So that's one vector by which it happens. The other vector, which you mentioned, is it gives you a chance to tell your story over time. And anytime people are trying to invest in a new company or make any other change in life, it takes some time to get used to the new. And so by engaging with them over time, you don't force them to answer the question, should I invest in this or not, after a single meeting. You have the chance to build over time the case, and it also gives them the ease of changing their mind or adopting new attitudes because they have a longer period of time over which they can do those various things. So that's the second thing that helps being on the same side of the table. And the third thing is that people have this principle where if they do someone a favor, they're going to like them more. This is actually something that Benjamin Franklin first identified instinctively and applied. So when you do someone a favor, your brain says, oh, well, why did I do this person a favor? I must like them. And so if you can successfully get people to buy in and help you build your case and spend time with you over multiple weeks or even months, and do you perceive themselves as doing a favor so that they'll like you, these are all reasons why it's better to be on one side of the table. But the big caveat is they have to actually do those things, right? They have to actually spend the time with you. They actually have to devote their time to improving and thinking through what you're doing. They have to do you the favor. And most investors won't do that. They're busy people. They're going to say no to most such requests. So therein lies the paradox and the challenge.
So the reason why the way that you pitch investors is by pitching them is that most investors, if they find that what you're working on is potentially interesting, will spend 30 minutes talking to you about it. And that's really all they're willing to invest in terms of their time, because they have to look at a lot of potential companies. And you can't expect, to reach out to somebody you don't know, who has no reason to believe that what you're working on will work, to invest more than 30 minutes into your business. And that's why you would just go and pitch in a concise manner so you can cross that point. But that still remains a very suboptimal way of communicating with them.
Right. And by the way, it's not easy to get an investor to agree to see your pitch, right? It's non-trivial. And so that is why building reputation, being introduced to them, having a set of accomplishments from the past that are relevant to what you're trying to do, having a very clear and concise way of telling your story, why all of these things are important, because you have to do work just to get to the point of doing the pitch.
And so since I am someone who has started businesses before and who has relationships with investors who are, which are personal relationships, and where those investors would put time into helping me, not just in the role as an investor, but also because of the relationship with me as a friend of mine. With some of those people, I have the opportunity to do things in a more optimal manner.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Chris, you're not a pre-seed investor, so I can't I wouldn't be trying to convince you to invest in any business. But obviously, you spend an hour and a half with me every week,
Right.
and we're friends, and we've been you invested a little bit of money in my previous business, but we're close friends. So you would kind of be the optimal person, assuming you were a pre-seed investor, to do that with. And in that case, that totally optimal case, what should I do to be maximally convincing to you?
So I think that if you have somebody with whom you have a very close relationship, I think you go to them early, even when you're like, I have a couple of instincts or it's an area that I'm interested in. And the value to that person is they're spending time with you and they're getting to shape things at the very earliest stages, right? When you're just considering what to do, you're still open to a lot of different things. And every investor has areas that they would like to see more great entrepreneurs working in. So those are some motivations that exist right there. I think that to a large extent, the beauty of having that close relationship is you get to go early on in the process and you get to start building that relationship even earlier. And part of it is if you do a good job with this, you strengthen the relationship, right? Sometimes people are worried, oh, I'm going to use up my political capital, I'm going to use up my reputational capital. I'm like, no, no. When you get together with people and they enjoy that experience, it just increases your political capital and your reputational capital.
So in an optimal situation, what I would do is that I would, go see somebody, super early in the process, and I don't really know what I'm, working on. So probably when I'm in the kind of like problem research phase, or towards the end of that problem research phase, I'd say, hey, here are some inklings I have about a potential problem that I've learned about and I've gathered evidence on. And would you say that there's a business to be built adjacent to this problem? And what's your reaction to this potential problem? Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I think that's right. And part of it is also you may do it in an iterative way. At the very beginning, you're like, here's some problem areas I'm thinking about. What do you think? And then when you lock in on one, you could say, hey, here's the sub areas that I've been looking at. I think it might be relevant. You could take a couple of different approaches. Each of those meetings could be relatively short. Right? What you don't want to do is to say, okay, we're going to sit down and invest 5 hours right now when it's far too early to invest that much time or get into that much detail.
And but so this is kind of like the optimal situation. But in real life, most of your relationships are not like this. So, for example, our common friend Ben Kasnoka, who's somebody that I know well. Like I've worked with him. He's an investor in my last business, but I don't have the same level of close relationship with him that I have with you. Meaning, we haven't spoken once a week for years, and to want to present something to somebody like Ben, I would want to have more evidence that what I will present is the right, is worth his time. And what would you say is the bar for enough evidence to talk to somebody like that?
Well, I think you need enough evidence to have convinced yourself. I think that's the bottom line. You have to be able to go into that meeting with a fairly strong belief that you've identified the general area that you're going to go after and the general way you're going to do it. The details may not have been fully worked out yet. And in fact, that's part of how you can get that IKEA effect going, by having that person help you with the details, especially if they have relevant experience. But the bottom line is, somebody like Ben likes to view themselves as a rationalist. He's wrong. All of us are doing things based on emotion all the time, but he likes to view himself as rational. So he wants to have a good reason for spending the time with you. And that reason would be that you have identified an area, you're a promising entrepreneur whom he trusts to actually pursue things that are potentially valuable. And because he's an early stage investor, it's his job to find out about things super early on. He might even bring you into an accelerator program, which is probably the lowest cost way for a venture capital firm to get a position in a startup. And so there's a whole bunch of rational reasons why, once you are convinced that you are likely to start a company in this area, that would make sense for an incubator / pre-seed startup, where you have pre-seed investor, where you have an existing relationship, to want to spend that time with you. Because at this point, you are a successful serial entrepreneur who's working on something, and that is something that all those investors want to talk with.
So there's this kind of point that you get at in your journey where you have confidence, or you've convinced yourself of the kind of problem and of some form of solution. So you're convinced you're going to work on this.
Yeah.
But you don't have and you have evidence. That's why you're convinced. But you do not have specifics as to what it is that you'll do, or you're not clear on those. And what's magical about this point is that there actually is an opportunity for this third party, or the second party, to contribute.
That's right. It is pretty clear that you're going to do something, and they have the opportunity to contribute. They may choose not to, but it at least means that the time they are spending, if they spend this time, will have the option to do more with you, and that you will be more likely to take their money if they eventually offer it. So all of a sudden there's optionality, and that is always very appealing to the investor class as well.
And then really, the optimal thing is to engage people at that time, really.
Yeah.
But most people won't do that. So say in Ben's case, I know him well, we get along really well, we've worked together, so I can do that. But even for other investors, like we had an interview we did for the podcast with Hadley Harris. So Hadley, I know him well, we've worked together, but not as closely as with Ben. He's never invested in me, although it's considered it. It's not the same. And then you can get further and further. And we discussed this guy, Ross Fubini, that was another person who did an interview with that I don't really know other than through you guys. So the further we get from a personal relationship, really what it is the more evidence I need to have to engage them.
Correct. Because what you want is, you want them to be interested so that you can now sit on the same side of the table and work together with them. But you won't get there until they're convinced. And here's a great example. It's a matter of public records. It's no problem with me talking about it in a podcast. My co-author, Reid Hoffman, of course, one of the most famous investors in the world, far more famous than me, by the way, but thank you for making me relatively famous. Reid, famously, his first venture investment was Airbnb. And with Airbnb, what happened was he actually turned them down prior to the Series A. In the previous round, an investor he knew came to him and said, "Hey, you should talk with these Airbnb guys." And Reid's like, "Okay, what are they doing?" He's like, "Oh, they're really formalizing couch surfing." And Reid said, "Oh, that doesn't seem very interesting. That's not a very big market." So he didn't meet with them. And then they made more progress, and a different investor then came to him and to introduce them for the Series A. Again, classic best practice. Get a trusted intermediary to introduce you to the investor. And this person said, "Hey, Reid, you should really talk with these founders. They're incredible." And Reid said, "Well, I looked at this earlier. What they're doing is not really interesting. This whole couch surfing thing is just a niche product." I said, "No, that's not what they're doing. They're doing an eBay for space, all physical locations. It's actually huge." And Reid's like, "Oh, well, that sounds different. Okay, let me meet with them." And so Reid set up an appointment. He met with them at the offices of Greylock on a Sunday afternoon. And he met the founders and they started talking. And 2 minutes into the conversation, Reid said, "I just want you guys to know I'm interested. I'm going to give you a term sheet. So let's spend the rest of this time figuring out actual, hey, how are we going to build this company? How can I help you? Let's make this a full working session." It's a classic example of why it's important for the investor as well to get on the same side of the table. Because if it truly is something you believe is going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, getting on the same side of the table and building that relationship is important for them to win the deal. But what is it that we take away from it? What we take away from it is having the evidence, having the credibility was so essential to getting Reid to decide, hey, I'll take a meeting. Because earlier on, they didn't have as much evidence, and the person that they tried to have introduced didn't do a good job. Reid didn't talk with them. Later on, they had more evidence. The person did a better job of pitching Reid. Reid agreed to the meeting. 2 minutes later, he's saying, "I'm going to give you a term sheet." And of course, the rest is history, as Airbnb is now worth nearly $100 billion, and Reid and Greylock made many billions of dollars off the investment. But it is because the founders didn't give up. They tried the first time. It didn't work. They marshaled more resources, gathered more evidence, did a better job of telling their story, and it did work the second time.
So what happened there between the first time they tried to talk to Reid and the second time is that they had gathered evidence. And since they didn't know Reid at all, Reid wasn't willing to invest any time until he saw some evidence.
And there was somebody with credibility who went to him and made a credible case for why he should talk with him.
Now, so that's kind of the kind of like general rule, which is people won't help you. Like people help you because they're your friend, but with their investor hat, they're looking for ROI. ROI for them is I'm going to invest time into this business that might be a business I want to invest in because there's evidence they'll be successful. There's a way to kind of like get around this for people who might not have these pre-existing relationships, or even like for me, that they're investors whose input I would actually want because they've invested in interesting businesses, and they would be a perfect fit VC for me. And I do want to learn from them authentically. And the way for me to get around the fact that I don't have a relationship with them and I don't have the evidence is to make it so that it is in their interest to spend time with me outside of the context of the business.
Yes, that's an additional thing. Like obviously, trusted intermediary telling the story very well, that's always important. But this is one of the other tricks that most people overlook, which is you can be valuable to the investor regardless of their interest in your particular business. So investors rely on entrepreneurs for being able to connect to other entrepreneurs. Right? That is when I tell people what's the best recommendation you get to a venture capitalist, if you can get an entrepreneur who made the money to recommend you as a fellow entrepreneur, that's gold. That's the single best kind of recommendation you can get. Now that's probably the primary way that you can be useful. There are other secondary ways. You could potentially educate them on a new area. So if a VC is trying to learn more about AI and you know a lot about AI and you're willing to take the time to explain it to them, they're going to be willing to take the time to spend it with you. If you are somebody who is really well connected maybe even with potential investors or LPs. Guess what? I've spoken with plenty of entrepreneurs who are like, oh, yeah, well, how can I help you? I'm like, well, yeah, I might need to connect with LPs. And if they have LPs to connect me with, believe me, I'll take that meeting. So there are other ways to make yourself useful, because the most important thing is to get into that meeting. That meeting is what gives you the chance to get them interested in what you're doing.
And I think I've connected you to potential LPs.
Yes,
Uh,
indeed, you have. That
there you
helped.
go. I was smart about that.
Bingo.
So, I think the summary of this is the ideal way to pitch an investor. And it's important to keep in mind that what you're doing is pitching them,
You're
is,
always
is,
pitching.
is to take them along, the journey. You want to do that as early as possible, but probably you can't do it as early as you'd like. And the more evidence you gather that your business is worth their time, the more, VCs who don't have another reason to help you will invest the time to give you input and to allow you to take them along this journey that would hopefully convince them to invest.
Absolutely. I think you've got it exactly right. And that's why there's a specific sequence of people that you meet with, right? You start off with the quote unquote friends and family. And if you're lucky, your friends and family include investors who are expert in these areas. And then you gradually go outwards from there, maybe the second order connections or people that you have a looser bond with. And then as you build momentum, you are then able to go all the way to complete strangers, because at that point in time, it's obvious that there is a real selfish reason for talking with you.
I've got to say, Chris, this is exactly why people need to like and subscribe, because like it is this kind of like truism that you should ask for advice, right? Not ask for money. There's actually this is like it's like ask for money, you'll get advice. Ask for advice, you'll get money. Is like everyone says this all the time.
Yes.
Yet in the startup space, for some reason, people don't believe this to be the case. Like that is not the advice or what anyone ever tells you
Well, because there
to
is
do.
nuance. There's nuance because, yes, of course, it is easier to get money if you ask for advice and vice versa. But how do you even get in the room to ask for the advice? How do you even get them to pay attention to your email? All the work is done before you get to that point.
And this is the type of stuff that only you can tell people. So that's why they need to like this video or subscribe to the channel. And I will thank you for the time, Chris. I'll thank everyone who joined our live stream for joining. Thank everyone who listened to this episode for listening. Guys, please comment if you have questions. We love answering them. And the most important is to thank our team, Brendan, Jeremy, and Shlok, for making all this possible.
Many thanks to the team and many thanks to you as well, Julien. And I will look forward to us gathering again on the other side of your trip to Thailand and my trip to Saudi Arabia and Oman.
We seem very jet set or very sketchy. I don't know. One or
We'll
the
see.
other.
We'll see. Possibly both.
Yeah. I've never been to Saudi Arabia, but I'm like a place I'm very like I really want to go to.
It's interesting. I mean, if you look on my blog, or I can send you a link, I wrote there. It's very different than I
I read it.
expected, changing very rapidly, and I'll learn more when I go back again.
When I was in Turkey, my wife met some people who, because it's kind of the same region, who lived
Yeah.
in Saudi Arabia, who are
Yep.
Westerners, and they loved it. They loved living in Riyadh.
Yeah.
Um,
It's very different than it was, thanks to MBS, who's done other things as well. We won't get into that, especially when we're recording. But it's very different. I mean, people when I was there were telling me, "Oh, wow, this is totally different than it was just 3 years ago." And there was excitement and energy, all the things that you like.
it is amazing how there are places in the world which are exciting and have a lot of energy, and then others don't, and it's a moment in time thing. So
Right.
like when I was in Istanbul, I was there for almost 3 years. Not all full time, but like overall, like during a period of 3 years, I was there quite a lot. And it really changed. Like it went
Yeah.
from, it became extremely depressed
Yes.
because of inflation.
Exactly. Inflation, the crippling foreign exchange problems and everything like that. I experienced this a little bit earlier because we were doing some work with Turkey and with an organization, and they were paying us in US dollars. But unfortunately for them, those US dollars were becoming more and more expensive from a Turkish perspective by the day.
And then, yeah, so it's such an interesting thing because probably in the period I was there when I got there, Saudi Arabia had been kind of like a grim place. And by the time
Yeah,
I left, Saudi Arabia would be super exciting.
exactly. Things can change very rapidly, and this happens all over the world. And so, the only constant is change.
I will let you go. I'm going to end